Welcome back to Sidewalk, Skyline podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Rogers. On today's episode, we're going to hear a session from our city, Windsor, recorded back in the spring. And the guests are Mike Morency and his wife, Kim Court. They are both professionals in social work, and they brought a session on dealing with grief. You know, Jesus said in the Beatitudes, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." Well, when we go through grief, it isn't always apparent that that is a comfortable thing. In fact, it's very uncomfortable for a lot of people. And yet, God's promise is that in the midst of that great distress, that great discomfort, that God would work towards our comfort to help us get through that valley of the shadow of death. So let's go to Kim and Mike's session at our city, Windsor. Hope it's helpful.
We've already been introduced by Pastor Kevin, but my name is Mike Morency, and with me is my beautiful wife, Kim Court. Yeah, there you go. And she's just making sure I know her name. That's right. Those of you who don't know us, we do some speaking at conferences and stuff like that. I'm part of the pastoral team here at New Song, but Kim actually does private practice counseling. She has her M.S.W. and does faith-based and traditional, well, I'm not sure another word, non-faith-based counseling for people in the community. Between the two of us, we have, it's kind of scary, about 50 years of community social work practice experience. Different fields. I tend to be much more community agency focused, and Kim tends to be much more individual practice therapy focused. So that's why this morning we talked very much about the programs and implementing social work principles into programs. And this afternoon, Kim's going to be taking the lead and talking really about grief and helping people deal with grief and loss, including our own grief and loss. Really, what's important to know about us, other than our work, we have 4 amazing children, and we're going to try not to tear up because we've both had our own grief experiences with the loss of people that we care very closely about, both family as well as people that we've worked with, including just last week. So please know that what we're going to share this morning is very much fact and research-based, but it's also coming from our hearts.
So I'm not going to read the slide because you can read that, but I just wanted to talk about some pieces and identifying from the get-go that grief is different than mourning. I think we tend to lump those together, but grief is everything that we naturally think and feel, all the stuff that happens on the inside of us after a loss. So we can kind of think of it as a container that holds our thoughts, our feelings, our images of our experiences, and when we're bereaved. Whereas mourning is taking that grief and kind of going public with it, where we're able to show that in our actions, in the ways that we're managing ourselves and how we express ourselves. So that can include, talking about things, crying about things, or using other mediums, right? Some people like to get really creative as a way to mourn and express the loss that they've incurred. So grief tends to come naturally for us. We tend to be thinkers and feelers, generally speaking, whereas mourning, we have to be a little bit more intentional in doing some activities to help us work through some of those thoughts and feelings and bring that outward instead of just living with it all inside. And I think the important thing that I want to highlight is mourning just isn't about funerals. Grief just isn't about losing a loved one. I mean, definitely yes, but we also have other forms of losses in our lives, which we'll talk about as we go, that still bring up those same feelings that we would have as if it was a loved one that we had lost. And I think that's important. Not everybody, they feel grief, but they don't kind of conceptualize it the same way. So there's no timeline in grief. right? Like you can't say, okay, I'm going to grieve for X amount of time and then things are going to be better and I'm just going to go on.
6 months.
It'd be nice if we
give it 6
could.
months.
It'd be nice if we could. But there is a little bit of a gauge, if you will, that we can use. So we have what we call anticipatory grief, which happens before a death or a loss, right? We're anticipating that a loss is coming or that a death is going to happen. And then there's acute grief, so that's when that loss happens, exactly at that point. Most people don't realize this, but we stay in what we call early grief for 2 years, right? And then we start to have mature grief. Who knows how long we have mature grief for? Take a guess. The rest of our lives, right? That never really goes away. We get better at managing it. We have new strategies.
Because the loss doesn't just go away.
It never goes away. It becomes part of who we are, and we have to incorporate that, and we'll talk about that a little bit down the way. So on this slide, you'll notice that there's a few different kinds of loss. So they talk about loss of attachment and that need for connection and bonding. So that can become from a loss of a pet, a family member, a friend, any of those kinds of things. Loss of territory, so we think about like our home, right?
A lot of the people I work with at Matthew House.
I was going to say people who are displaced or refugees, right? Aboriginal people. Loss of structure is divorce, maybe a loss of a child, moving, and changing churches can also be a loss of structure because you're wanting to do in this part is to feel important, feel involved, and feel valued. And all of those things can be interrupted at those times. Loss of identity. Many people have lost jobs, have had missed opportunities, have major life changes. They talk about graduation as we think about that as a happy time, but really that can be a grief period. You're ending being at home maybe with your parents or living in your hometown and moving away, and there's a lot of losses embedded in that. Loss of future would be loss of those dreams or goals maybe that you had that you had wished you could have achieved, but for whatever reason they weren't able to come to fruition. And then from all of these losses also comes what we call secondary losses, right? So it could be a support system, it could be our financial stability, it could be our faith, it could be our health, a sense of belonging or a sense of self-worth.
So, Kim, if let's say your dream for your child. So I was listening to the radio on the way in, and one woman was talking about how she had a child who was born with Down syndrome, and she had to grieve the dreams that she had for her unborn child. Well, once the child was born, she had the dreams before the child. Where would that fit, and really does it matter where it fits so much as just knowing that it is grief?
I think that's the important thing. It doesn't fit. We're giving you some things just to kind of help flesh out different kinds of grief. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what kind of grief. Like I said before, we're going to grieve the same way. But part of it could be, that giving up that dream. We had one of our children who were diagnosed with a nonverbal learning disability, right? And ADHD and other things. And I had visions of what their life was going to be like. And then I had to work through my own feelings of recognizing it's going to be a different journey than I had originally thought for them or for us, right? It didn't matter what it was called. The feelings were still the same and the work is still the same.
So loss is loss, grief is grief.
Next slide. All right, so symptoms of grief, there's a whole long list here, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but I will talk about a few. So a lot of lethargy and lack of energy. Anybody who's experienced loss probably goes, I remember that feeling. I just didn't have the energy to get up and get out of bed. And that's normal and natural because all of our energy is going to us processing what's going on inside and what we're experiencing at that time. In addition to probably the fact that we're not eating the same, we're not sleeping the same, that can all contribute to that. There can be an increased susceptibility to illness, and part of that's because our immune system is being suppressed during all of these feelings that are going up, in addition to all the changes that we had just talked about on top of that before. Decreased confidence in our self-esteem, right? Like, who are we now? What does this mean? How does it impact me? Where do I fit into all of this? and still needing to find ourselves again. Increase in anxiety because of that lack of control that we have in the loss, right? Especially when it's been traumatic, it's been sudden, those kinds of things, right? If this can happen, what else can happen in the world, right? And then changes in interpersonal relationships. Oftentimes, I think back to when I was younger and my grandfather had passed away and all of his family came over and they were helping clean the house and they were doing all these kinds of things. That lasted for a while, not for long, a couple months or 6 months, I don't know, time was different when I was younger, but then we never saw them again. So those are changes in relationships. You think of a divorce. Sometimes families feel like they need to make a decision about who they're going to stay connected to. There's another loss, right?
It is important to note that grief looks different for everybody. And unlikely that somebody's going to have all of these symptoms. Like, this isn't a tick list of symptoms, right? There may be symptoms that they have that aren't listed here. Or they may have, it might be just changes in their appetite and weight, but you're not seeing a whole lot in other areas. It's everybody manifests or experiences grief in a different way.
And I think the key, what we want to really do here for the people that we're supporting and for ourselves, right, is to talk about these are normal, natural experiences and feelings. Because so often the people I work with who are experiencing grief are like, why can't I remember things? Why is this happening?
Why can't I just get out of bed?
Any of those kinds of things, and they feel like there's something wrong with them. So knowing that these are just kind of potential natural symptoms that they may feel is really helpful for them. They're okay, I'm normal, I'm all right, I'm going to be okay. That's
and
really
for
important.
ourselves too.
Yeah. Okay, next. All right, again, another laundry list of feelings that are in grief. I think what I want to highlight is that the initial grief experience, often we feel dazed, stunned, right? And that's nature's way of temporarily protecting the person from the full reality of the loss. It's like letting little pieces dribble in at a time, right? Because taking it all in and understanding all the concepts behind it is overwhelming, and that would just create anxiety and further depression in those feelings. Emotions need time to catch up to what the mind is trying to process. Short-term memory is also impacted by shock, right? When we're in shock and we can't process things that are going on, then it's really hard to take in any information that's coming to us. That's why it's so often when you're working with people who are grieving to just sit with them. I think as people we feel we need to fill in all the times and the gaps and the spaces, and really that's not what they need. They just want a body next to them knowing that someone's there to comfort them and offer a helping hand along the way. Denial is similar to shock and numbness. It's a protector in those early stages of the grief. Sadness. This is one where a lot of people struggle. Sitting with somebody who's really distraught and upset and sobbing and crying.
I don't like that.
We want to make things better for them. We want to cheer them up. But that's about us. That's not about them and what their needs are. So tears don't equal weakness, even though those are messages that sometimes we have grown up with, or the people that we're going to be supporting have grown up with.
And they may feel unsafe to us, especially, again, if we haven't grown up with those messages that it's safe to cry, it's safe to be. Again, my mom was great, but I still am not terribly comfortable with people getting overly, well, I'm going to say overly emotional, but again, that's me putting a label on it.
So crying in itself is an act of mourning, and it's nature's way of releasing all of that tension and stress hormone and all the stress hormones that are trapped inside the body. So it becomes essential. David Kessler put it this way, and I thought it was just really profound, because people worry about the tears that come down, and I'm going to cry forever, and I'm never going to stop. David Kessler said, every tear is a drop of sadness, and you're going to cry as long as you need to cry, as heavy as you need to cry, until that sadness has been fully released. So I think that's important to take when you're working with people too, right? And then sometimes, I'll own a little piece here, I felt when my mom passed away, and I remember planning for her life celebration, and I was out trying to buy, silly things really, to bring to her celebration. And I remember being in the store, and I thought, I must be losing my mind. I can't figure out what I want. I don't know what decision to make, and I just was kind of like paralyzed in the aisle. And then you happened to call, and he's like, how are you doing? And I'm like, I'm a hot mess. Like, I have no idea. I can't even decide between this vase or that vase. So that's just my own personal illustration to kind of say, you know what, it's all okay. You don't have to have those things. If we can show up and be that person just there to support and say, hey, I'll just stand beside you. You pick what you want. That can make all the difference for people. Some people think that, having faith and openly mourning are mutually exclusive. Yet when we look at what the Bible tells us, it'll say that it's okay for people to be angry at God.
David sure was.
Lots of people,
yeah.
Right? And so sometimes people that we're supporting might want to take a break from coming to church. They might want to take a break from having somebody pray with them or reading the Bible. And we want to be mindful not to judge that. That's their journey. Grief is an individual journey. So we want to be there and support them. And from time to time offer and say, hey, could I pray for you today? And they may say yes, they may say no. Could I read this passage to you, right? But I talk to them and see what they're comfortable with. And no matter what feelings come up, it's important that we don't want to be harsh and we don't want to be judging anybody, ourselves or them. The key for me, I always say, is be kind and compassionate to whatever feeling comes up.
Because feelings are not always logical.
They're not logical.
Right, and especially if we're fixers. Anyone other fixers in the room? Yeah, so we want things to make sense and we want to fix things, but when that person is in grief or when we are in grief, the thinking, the feelings don't make sense, and that needs to be okay.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of feelings that come up are those guilt feelings, those shame feelings, those regret feelings, and those can be really, really heavy. And they can pull us into depression. They can pull us into feelings of anxiety. So if we can take that instead and pour loving kindness onto ourselves and to others and fill that with positive words instead, like, you know what, it's just a feeling, it's okay, don't hold on to that, let that go. That can be critical to helping people cope. And the other important thing I wanted to highlight is when we're in grief, we want to make sure that we stay connected. We are connecting with the people who are grieving, and that we're supporting them to do small baby steps each day. We don't want them to become frozen kind of in space and time. So maybe it's, you know what, today you get up and have a shower, or maybe it's you walk to the mailbox. Anything that looks like forward movement for them gives that momentum and that idea that grief is moving to.
Great. So how many of you, I see Pastor Brian here, are there any other pastors in the room? No? All right. Anyone else giving leadership to a Christian ministry in a paid role? One. Anyone else? Everybody else, I'm assuming, is volunteering in a Christian ministry in some capacity. Okay. How many are working with people who are street involved or unhoused? A couple. How about people working with others who are struggling with mental health or addictions? Okay, more. What about children and youth? Okay, a few. Newcomers?
I bring gospel to jail.
Okay, into the jail. What about those with intellectual and physical disabilities?
I work with the handicapped.
Okay. And what about seniors? So the reason I did that is because grief can look different in different populations. So while the symptoms and feelings of grief are the same, the processes of grief are the same, they may present or appear different in various populations or groups. What appears to be an emotional outburst, inappropriate behavior, substance use, panic, or other changes in mood or activity or behavior may in fact be grief. So I'm going to ask if there's a couple of brave people here. Don't identify the person, but if anybody here can identify what is something that you have seen in the population you work with that maybe right away or maybe down the road you clued in, oh, they're grieving. Anyone?
I mean, working with youth, there's a lot of just,
Yeah, sorry.
I mean, thank you.
Here are tapes.
Working with youth, there's a lot of kids who deal with divorced parents and
Which
the
is
grief
loss.
of losing a stable house.
Okay.
Um,
So what might their grief look like that might be different from yours?
I had to balance what I was lucky to have a stable family and to be able to show them who the father is.
Yeah.
So when they never had a father that was there,
Yeah.
was huge, and that was just me being more nurturing to them
Yeah.
in a, of course, acceptable way.
Yeah. Thank you. So really, I've found, so when I was, it's been many years since I worked with youth, but I found youth were, that I worked with, were more likely to, A, blame God and lose faith, because their faith is pretty immature, right? Because they're youth. The other thing is that they tended to either be much more outwardly angry or much more likely to withdraw. And I remember one family I worked with in Kitchener, and there were 3 boys, and all 3 boys manifested or you saw their grief in a different way. One went completely off the wall and ended up like stealing cars and busting a store window and ended up in jail. One just went into his bedroom in the basement and wouldn't come out. But you will see grief in different ways. I remember years ago I worked at Huronia Regional Center with people with intellectual and physical disabilities, and had opportunity to work with a woman, and unfortunately had to tell her that, I mean, this was a 60-year-old woman, but with intellectual disabilities, and had to tell her that her mom and dad had died in a car accident. And at first I thought she didn't understand me, because she was smiling and she actually got all bubbly, and for days afterwards I actually talked to the supervising chaplain and said, help me understand what's going on here. Like, is she not understanding what I told her? And he said, no, that's her way of coping. And whether it was a full understanding or not, she got it, evidenced by the behavior change. So really this slide is about just pointing out that it's going to look different, and we need to get to know the people we're working with, both our co-workers and those we're seeking to minister to, in order to gain an understanding of where their struggles are coming from, because it may very well be grief that we're dealing with, not just somebody being a jerk. All right. Types of grief. Again, I'm not going to read through this whole list. We talked about sources of grief. Types of grief is a little bit different. One of the ones that we talked about, source is also a type as far as being disenfranchised. So those who are street involved, those often experience disenfranchised grief or traumatic grief. But they also may experience prolonged grief or complicated grief. And again, I'm not going to define all of these, but it's important to have a bit of an understanding that if they're experiencing prolonged grief, right, that's something that, as the name implies, is prolonged, right? It's not they've been grieving for 6 months, you know, they're 3-4 years into this thing, and they're still very much struggling with the grief, right? Or cumulative. They're not done grieving this, and then this happened. and they're not done grieving this, but this happened, and they're not done grieving this, but this happened, right? So all of those things are important to understand, not in the sense of the approach to journeying with them being a whole lot different, but it's important for us to understand where they're coming from. You know, is it the loss of their dog that they're upset about, or did the loss of their dog trigger the loss of their mom, or the loss of their dad, or et cetera, so forth, right? Other losses that haven't been appropriately grieved.
All right, so if any of you are familiar with grief, these stages will look really familiar to you. They're from Kubler-Ross, Dr. Kubler-Ross. She came up with these common stages for people who themselves were dying. And then they realized that there were commonalities between that person's grief journey and what people who experience loss, whether that be a death or any other kind of loss, experience as well. So I think most people are familiar with those, but there's been lately in the research a sixth stage, and I don't know if anybody's aware of these ones that are emerging, called finding meaning. So after we've been able to do the denial, the anger, the bargaining, the depression, and we get to a place where we're able to accept, and I don't like the word accept, I like the idea of reconciling, because I don't think we ever fully accept that we've had that loss, but we
don't necessarily want to accept
we don't want to, but somehow we've kind of taken that and put that into who we are as a person, and it becomes part of who we are and how we carry forward. So I like the word reconciling. But finding meaning, and you can switch to the next slide, is again, like grief, it's a very personal journey. It has its own individual meaning that nobody else can put on that for you or the other person. It is theirs alone. It takes time, right? If we think about, we're coming out of grief and after 2 years or so, we still need time after that possibly to find the meaning that we want to make. So that can come years and years after the loss. So I think the other thing is people believe that they have to, find some kind of understanding in order to make meaning. And again, that's a false number that we have as well. We're probably never really going to understand all the depths of all the pieces.
It's not a matter of answering why the loss happened, not why did Dad die, or why did this happen, but
it's being able to identify kind of why you're here. What was the purpose in this journey that you've kind of gone on? Where do you want to go for the rest of your life? What was the significance that's been left behind for those who are still living? When we find meaning, we're able to move forward in our grief, and that's the thing that helps us kind of come unstuck from some of those last lingering pieces. Again, recognizing grief never truly goes away. It's deeply personal. Sometimes people like to use things like journals, creative arts, as a way to kind of express themselves, collect their thoughts, and just start to develop what they think may be meaning. And again, I'm a little bit of a David Kessler fan. He said, remembering those who have died with more love than pain is when we start to move into that making meaning stage.
so
Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah. So when we're able to remember those who have died, or I'm going to say, or the loss that you've experienced, right? It doesn't just have to be a death. When we can do that with more love than pain, we're moving into that making meaning phase.
So, you guys know that expression, my person, okay? I'm not a mama's boy, but my mom was my person. And I certainly took her death quite hard. But I had an opportunity. She had sponsored a child through Compassion. And as part of my making meaning, I decided to take on that sponsorship and carried that through for the last 8 years until he graduated the program. And then my mom had started a ministry while she was living called Mothers for Mothers, which did very much like what Safe Families does now. So we've now switched that support over to Safe Families. And that's just one small meaningful way for me. It's in some ways it's a little bit selfish because it's not even about Bintang or safe families. It's about me and honoring my mom because that's how I am making meaning. But I mean, you've talked about other people, having conversations with people, or writing letters, or there's again, there's a wide array, but it's that making meaning that allows you to live in that love and not pain.
So here's what we want grief to, how we want it to work. We want it to be linear. We start here and we end there. Lovely, done.
I like that.
Right? But really, when you think about it, that scraggly bit of like beat up yarn that's all kind of tangled and knotted and twisted in 50 directions, that's really what grief is like. Right? I just like visuals sometimes, so.
So here's the thing, as people serving in church and community ministry, our grief can get in the way. You may not even realize it. You may not even realize that you're being triggered or your grief is getting in the way. So here's some signs that your grief may be getting in the way. You're getting activated, you're getting triggered or threatened by their emotions, right? So, if somebody is crying and upset about their loss, instead of being able to attend to them and their needs, you're feeling ill at ease. You're feeling all tense. Well, it could be because your grief is getting triggered. Again, wanting to make the person feel better. This is usually about your own discomfort and upset, right? Rather than their needs. Focusing and concentrating are too difficult for you, right? So maybe you're not getting triggered, but your grief is just getting in the way of you doing the ministry work. Wanting to help, I already said that, fix them. Filling the silence. I really struggle with that. Anybody else? Yeah. Shh. If you need to, I will. If you've ever seen Pastor Kevin Rogers in a Bible study, he goes like this, right? Which I think is hilarious. You probably know why. But it's made me think, and I've started going like this when I'm in meetings to try and prompt myself to just shut up. Because so often when we're trying to support somebody who is grieving, as Kim said earlier, we just need to be with them. We don't necessarily need to say anything, right? So when Kim called me on the phone, she didn't need me to rush over to the grocery store and say, okay, pick this vase or pick this candy. No, she just needed me to be there, right? So if we can't do that, if we find ourselves needing to give advice or needing to push them, or if our integrity or our professionalism is starting to show cracks, then it could be that our own grief is getting in the way of the work that we're trying to do.
So, if your grief is popping up, here's some things that we can think about. Be curious about those triggers, right? What is it? What are those hot buttons that are coming up for you? Where are they coming from? What are they? Give yourself some space and some time and your freedom to go back and grieve, right? If you can't be present in that moment, maybe you just go to the bathroom for a few seconds, take a few deep breaths and say, okay, I can't be curious about my grief right now, but I'm going to be intentional and make a point to come back to that after. And right now I'm going to take a breath and I'm just going to be able to pop in and be with that person in their moment. Think about what you need. Is there something you need to be able to work through your personal feelings and your grief? Is there something that you need to be able to sit beside that person while they're weeping and they're tearing?
And maybe you can't. And if you're even if you're paid to do it, sometimes we cannot do the work, right? As a pastor, I've had Times when I've had people come to me and I was not in the proper state of mind, state of heart to appropriately minister to that person because of things that had happened in my life. Is that a bad thing? No. You are human. I am human. What would be bad is if I tried to push through that and allowed my grief to impact that other person.
Or that other person who's grieving and you say, oh, I know what that's like. I had a so-and-so pass away, or yeah, I lost my job too and it was devastating because then that meant I lost my house and this and this and this. I mean, that's not going to be helpful for the other person, right?
No, because that makes it about you.
Yeah, you're there as the supporter, that friendly shoulder to lean on.
Mm-hmm. So moving on? Yeah. Okay. All right. So here's the thing. When your grief does show up, it does cause problems. And it's impossible to support others without ourselves showing up. But in doing so, we bring our own individual experiences, losses, beliefs, trauma, and personalities. But the person, as a result, may not be heard. You will be unable to sit in the grief with them. How many of you have ever sat in a hospital room with somebody who is severely ill or dying? That is hard. That is hard. How many of you have just sat with somebody in a funeral home or in their home after they lost somebody? That is hard. And when our grief shows up, we're not going to be able to do that. We'll be unable to create the safe space that the individuals need. But this is the neat thing, because it ties into what Brian was saying this morning. When we can shut up, listen, and learn their story, it becomes healing for them. It becomes relationally building between you and that person. And in the long run, again, we're coming from Christian ministries, that's going to create receptivity, because they know you are a safe place. They know you are a safe person who cares enough to shut up and listen.
And sometimes in order to do that, we need our person, right? If we're showing up for everybody else, we need a person that we can turn to and talk to about our experiences and our feelings. I remember when your mom passed away and you and the kids were distraught, and
we were a mess. We actually had 4 years of, we're not going to spell it all out, but
I remember thinking like, oh my gosh, like there is nothing I can do here to make anything better, and talk about feeling helpless, right? Like your husband and your kids, you want to be able to do something. So I remember the one day I rushed home from the funeral before everybody else did. I don't even remember where they all were. But I called my friend Kathy and I said to Kath, and I just started sobbing. I said, I feel so helpless, I don't know what to do. Like I've never felt this way before. It was a horrible, horrible feeling. But to be able to come home and talk to somebody else who was separate from that, pour it out, and just, have her hear me, then allowed me to be able to then show up for the loved ones that I was caring for in that situation. So if you have that person or a pastoral team or people within your church that you can turn to, I think it's really good if you're ministering to individuals who are grieving to kind of know who those people are, so you can reach out to them and not have to kind of think about them in the middle of the crisis. Already have that kind of pre-planned, so you have someone.
And that kind of ties up in my workshop this morning, where we talked about don't try and do this work alone. Urban ministry, community ministry, regardless of the population you're working with, is hard. I was laughing about what Pastor Brian said about the junior youth. I did youth ministry. It's hard. I worked with at-risk youth. It's hard. Worked at the downtown mission. It's hard. Don't try and do it alone. Get a support team around yourself and that you can, bounce things off of, pray with, etc.
So, as people, we're neurologically wired for empathy. That's probably why we're all sitting in this room right now, right? We want to feel with other people. So the Bible states, Romans 12:15, it says to us, you know what, mourn with those who mourn. Because our inherent desire to make people feel better often does more harm than good. So instead of trying to push them to feel better, to fix it, just mourn with them.
You're in the speaker though.
The foundation of serving comes from a place of connection, and that's what everybody who is grieving needs, is that connection. Empathy, genuineness, honesty, respect, those are the essential elements for supporting others. So is trust, which means that we're responsible for doing the right thing by maintaining our own, what Mike had just talked about, high level of professionalism and personal integrity at all times. Sounds really simple when I read it out loud, but I know that it's an extremely difficult thing to do. So all the more reason to rely on your supports. So, how do we journey with others in grief? So we want to remember they're not broken, not fit. They don't need to be fixed, which we've said multiple times. And the true expert in grief is actually the person who's grieving that particular loss. And that our role as a supporter is to understand and to get the whole story of the whole individual.
Which means, again, shh and listen.
Connection is important for their well-being and our own, right? It's mutually back and forth. We want to use a full mind, body, spirit, faith-based approach to grief. We don't want to just come at it from the mind. Well, if you changed your thoughts or if you did this, then everything would be better. It's because the person is not just one.
Just get out and do something. Just get active.
Yeah. Just write in that journal, would you? We want to support people to cultivate ongoing relationships with their loved ones who have died. Right? So we want to be able to share stories that we might remember about their mother, father, brother, grandmother.
That's not as woo-hoo as it sounds.
No.
Yeah, it ties into the fine dining piece.
Yeah. So we want to also show up and make sure that that person feels fully heard and supported. We want to continue to be present for them. So if you are just going to come in and say, I'm here for you, and then disappear, that's not helpful. That's really kind of another loss to them in that period of time, right? And sometimes we'll say, if you need something, call me.
You're not going to call.
No.
No.
How many of us in grief called when we needed something? We kind of hoped somebody was going to call us, right? So that means
How many times, though, have we said, if you need something, call me?
lots of times. So what we want to do is say, you know what? Here's how I can show up for you. I'm going to bring you meals on Monday and Thursday. And you know what? I'm going to pick you up and we'll go grocery shopping on this day. Or whatever that looks like, right?
Their first time back to church will probably be huge.
Yeah.
So saying, hey, you know what? If you're ready, I'll pick you up. We'll sit at the back of the church together. That may be huge. That may be what gets them in the door of the church. Rather than thinking they have to go there by themselves and everybody's going to swarm them and ask them, oh, are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's the worst.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And we want to embrace our own awkwardness, right? Like,
That's good.
yeah, because you're already awkward. But I mean, I never know what to say to somebody in the receiving line, because words just seem inadequate, right? So it's okay. Be honest that you feel awkward. I don't know what to say right now for you. I don't know what to do, but I'm just going to sit here. And I'm just going to be here. And if you need something, you let me know, right? And I'm going to keep showing up for you. If you can do that and you mean that. Recognizing that you're not going to be perfect. Human relationships aren't meant to be perfect, and that's okay. Don't be hard on yourself. Give yourself some grace in that. You're doing the best that you can for whoever it is that you're showing up for. And the other thing is, in order to be able to take care of others, who do we need to take care of first? Absolutely. So your self-care becomes essential to maintain your own emotional, intellectual, spiritual, and social wellness. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think in a few times in here, you're just pointing at it in your notes, but It's really important to recognize that this is their journey. And again, it ties into what we were saying in the other workshop. You know, as a society, we're really big on lived experience. And don't get me wrong, people with lived experience have experience more than somebody without lived experience. However, your lived experience is not universal experience. So your lived experience is your experience. So your grief journey isn't going to be somebody else's grief journey. And we need to allow them to be in charge of their own journey.
And I think we're all here because we recognize what an honor it is to be able to walk alongside somebody and gently guide them through their darkest days. I mean, think about that. When we're our most vulnerable, what a privilege it is to have someone come alongside us, or for us to walk alongside somebody else. And in your darkest despair, that's a pretty incredible honor. So, what are some requests that the grieving people have made? I think you've already shown up and listened, right? That's going to be our first important thing that they want. We've already talked about many of these, so I don't know if I need to go over all of them. But you want to avoid that, oh, you poor thing, this made me so rough. Like, how condescending can that voice be, right? And we don't want to give them those cliches. Things will look better tomorrow, or whatever it is that people say. Don't do it. If that's all you can come up with, just be quiet. Like, that would be much better for the person.
Again, don't judge them.
Don't judge them.
Including if they don't go to church.
Absolutely.
If they don't want you to pray with them. You know, even if they're a pastor. They're human.
Yeah, I think that was the majority of that slide.
Well, I think you got in your notes, you know, you can offer to help them remember some of the good, right? You could offer to write down some things or tell stories of the person. You know, one of the things that people like about funerals is that, the positive stories. And I know hearing some things about my mom at her funeral was very healing for me. Right?
We were just away on vacation, and we were sitting down having breakfast in the hotel, and there was this table kind of off to the side. I'm a people watcher, so he's busy eating and I'm watching, and there was this mom and her 2 daughters, and I saw this sadness all across here, and I just thought, oh, interesting. Now I'm going to kind of watch and see what that's all about. And then I thought, oh, I think they're grieving. And the next thing you know, I heard them talking about all of these fun memories, and they were pulling up pictures on their phone, and you just saw their face light up as they recalled these memories and things that they had shared. And it was interesting to watch, because when the story stopped, the smile stayed, but the eyes changed. The sadness came back to the eyes. So,
because the loss doesn't go away.
yeah, it's just a while that moment of happiness and joy and recalling all that, it just gets, flushed back. But it's important that we do that with people in grief.
So I'm a visual person too, and I'm really big on trying to give people models. And the 5 stages of grief is great, especially when you add in the 6th stage that Dr. Kessler talked about, or David Kessler talked about. But this is a bit of a grief process for God's people, and the first 3 are very similar to the first 3 in the 5 stages of grief. But really what's important for us as believers, for ourselves and when we're ministering to other people in those early stage, is that we don't do cliches or empty Christianese. People don't want to hear that it is all God's plan or purpose, right? I mean, how many of you has had somebody say that to you and you wanted to shove something down their throat, right? In the early stage, you don't want to hear that, and we do damage to our relationship and their healing journey when we do that. We need to recognize that the wrestling with reality can cause alienation from God, and I talked about that just a minute ago, and we need to be okay with that, right? As a pastor, I know that I've struggled with that. What do you mean they're not coming to church? They need God now more than ever. Well, that's true, but that's not for me to judge. I need to be okay with them going through the struggle, wrestling it out. We need to give them the time and space to wrestle it through without judging them. The turning or returning to God and moving toward healing are really part of that finding meaning that Kim spoke about earlier. And it goes to, the whole process. I was thinking about this when Brian was speaking this morning. Almost every one of those little arrows, if you picture, that's listen, learn, listen, learn, listen, learn, listen, learn. That's our job throughout that whole messy journey. So, I do want to save some time for some questions, but I don't want to skip over Scripture because we are a Christian ministry conference. Obviously, grief is in Scripture. Grief is part of life, but we're not without hope. Our job as believers is to convey that hope of Jesus Christ on to others. The trust is an essential part of this work. Sorry, I lost my spot there. Christ understands grief, and I do want to read the passage from John 11. If you got your Bibles, feel free to pull it up. John 11:35. Who knows what that passage says? I don't even need to read it. Jesus wept. What was Jesus weeping about? What's that? Lazarus. So, but, yes, but was he weeping over the death of Lazarus?
No, the unbelief.
What was he weeping over?
The hardness of the heart goes around.
Yeah, the state of the heart, right? And then also the passage in Hebrews, we're going to read it really quickly. Hebrews 5:7-9 says this: during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered, and once made perfect, he became the source of eternal life for all who obey him. So that's where the hope comes from as believers, right? But the grief comes before the hope. The passages, and these are in your notes, the passages in Revelation and 2 Corinthians as well, just really reinforce that there is the grief, okay? There is the grief, but hope comes after the grief.
So here's the two universal truths about grief. There's only one right way to grieve, and that's your way, right? Whatever's right for you is right for you.
I knew it. My way was the right way.
For me, this is what I live with. Anyway, second, the only way around grief is through it. We can try to dance around it and tiptoe and do all kinds of cartwheels, but I'm sorry, we all have to go through it. And any attempts to avoid suffering or putting off processing the emotion is just going to delay that grief and depression, and can contribute to those other forms of grief that Mike had talked about earlier: prolonged, complicated, cumulative, those kinds of things. I'm going to leave you with a couple quotes for grief. Okay. So grief lasts as long as love lasts. There's no expiration date, there's no timeline, and most of what we've learned about grief isn't even correct. It evolves just like any other relationship. There's never a time where you stop loving, in this example, your child, your mother, whoever it may be, And there's never a time when you stop missing your mom or wishing that dream had come to fruition or whatever the case may be. And that's Megan Divine. And then there's no greater gift that you can give someone in grief than to ask them about their loved one. We talked about that already, right? And then truly, truly listen. When we see our sorrow in the eyes of another, then we know that our grief is being heard and it really does have some meaning. And then, so I had a friend, very dear friend I met. I dated her son when I was younger, and we became really good friends for 30 some odd years. And she had all kinds of adversity and loss after the other, after the other, after the other. And on her wall hung Ecclesiastes. And so I've kind of made this one of my favorite scripture verses as well. And so in honor of Kathy, I kind of wanted to put that up there to say that in every season, a time and purpose under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to break down, a time to build up, a time to weep, a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance.
So, with my pastoral hat on, last church I was at, pastor there was actually doing a book about grief and loss and how the church handled that, and we haven't handled it well in the evangelical church, because we talk so much about, the love of Jesus and the power of Jesus, but there needs to be place. There is a time to weep. And we need to simply sit with people in their grief sometimes. So, any questions?
Go to 1, 2, and
Where I live, there's a lot of different, there's a lot of different, there's a lot of different populations where I live in Glengarry, and I've seen different aspects of grief, loss, death of someone, death of a pet even, and so as a person that works in the community, is there like other challenges to try to, like how do you go about this, like using the examples from the outline that you gave us to help someone through their grief, and then to use the examples that we learned today to get through our own, or like,
You mean as you're helping other people, it's stirring up some of your own stuff?
Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of journaling. I know not everybody is, and it doesn't have to be something you do every day, but just even when those feelings come. And it doesn't have to be sentences. Just scribble the words out, the thoughts out, because sometimes that can give you a different perspective of what's going on, right? Even just getting out and walking and being in nature and getting the sun, or praying, or any of those kinds of things. It's what feels right for you, what kind of helps you just get out of that space and kind of allow you some time.
And then you can work on the same for your own grief then,
And I'm thinking that can be for you, right? So that you can then show up and be that listener and that supporter friend for the other person. Don't worry about telling them how to do it. You make sure that you're feeling grounded and stable kind of with your own thoughts and feelings around the grief that comes up, because it will, when you least expect it.
Yeah, so I mean, again, if we can position ourselves by dealing with our own grief to be able to comfortably just sit quiet, people will navigate their grief, I don't want to say on their own, because they need us there.
They're going to navigate it in how they need to navigate it, right?
Yeah. And we can support them in that by being there and not complicating it for them with our stuff, right? Any other questions?
I just wanted to say one thing. Through grieving my daughter, it's been a year. I find that the one thing is if I reveal it, I can feel it, and then I can heal it, instead of stuffing it down.
Absolutely. We're afraid of our feelings sometimes because they're so intense, right? They're so heavy. But you're dead bang on. The minute you can bring it up and you can, and just like I said, be kind and compassionate and know it's there and just let it come out, that's how you're going to be able to grieve and move forward.
Well, and you and I have talked a lot about the importance of mourning and that public display. I mean, there was a time when, you're like, no funeral for me, nothing, but you've come to understand, I've come to understand the importance of letting the tears out. Letting those outward forms of grief, the mourning, happen.
The
If we get-
anger. I think we're afraid to sometimes say that we're angry. Let it out.
Yeah.
Really angry when my daughter died. She hung herself, and I was so angry, and I was numb. Now I have peace because Jesus Christ, I gave him all my pain. I can help others again through that kind of grief. I understand.
But it's really wrong.
So you were so angry, you were numb.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
she would hang herself. Yeah.
Right.
It's rather-
That's that finding meaning.
I was going to say you made meaning through joy and peace. Yeah.
Yeah. But you had to wrestle through the anger,
I had to.
right? And that probably wasn't pretty looking. No.
Hey, on the next episode of Sidewalk Skyline podcast, I travel to Cambridge, Ontario, and Paris, Ontario, where I trail around with a camera talking to Maury Blair. Maury is 86 years old. He's the author of Child of Woe, a chronicle of incredible child abuse that he endured when he was a child, and just the journey through his grief, the journey through his discovery of the love of God and healing from such severe trauma. And many people know Maury as one of the first people in Canada involved in establishing a teen challenge center in Toronto. They know him for Breakthrough Ministries and his book Child of Woe. For many, many years, speaking in schools, speaking in churches, speaking anywhere he could to tell his story and bring hope to other survivors. But in the last few years, as Maury is aging and been a little less active on the speaking circuit, a little less involved, I became involved in his board for Breakthrough Ministries, and we've endeavored to do some legacy projects. One of those projects is a rewrite of Child of Woe with new graphics. Also working on a graphic novel of his story. And this episode will be part of some video projects that we're doing with Maury to try and capture some of the things that didn't get captured as much in the book or since the bulk of his ministry life. So be sure to come back. This is going to be an episode with some on the street footage as well, wandering around Paris, Ontario, talking to Maury. As often is the case, there will be episodes like this upcoming one on my YouTube channel, Kevin Rogers. So it's going to be a good one, and I can't wait to hear it myself. So come on back. Until that time, I'm your host, Kevin Rogers. You're listening to Sidewalk Skyline Podcast.